Rome wasn't just a city, it was a living, breathing monster. A place where gold gleamed atop temples, while the streets below ran thick with things you wouldn't dare name. This was the empire that conquered the world, yes, but step outside your door, and you'd find it smelled like a butcher's backroom in midsummer. Let's start with the streets. You've seen the grand avenues in paintings, wide, orderly, lined with statues. Now forget them. Most of Rome was a labyrinth of alleys so narrow you could stretch out your arms and touch both walls, and you wouldn't want to. The plaster was peeling, stained with grime, and things far worse. The ground underfoot wasn't cobblestone. It was a mush of mud, rotting food and human waste. There were no public toilets, not really. If you needed to go, you did it in a pot, and then, well, out the window it went. That's right. The famous Roman cry of Gardilou wasn't some cheerful greeting, it was a warning. A heads up that a slop bucket was about to come flying down onto the street where you stood. Miss the shout, and you'd be wearing someone's dinner. The law tried to stop it, fining people for dumping waste. But in a city of 1 million souls, and who was going to catch everyone? And the smell. Oh, the smell. Imagine a tavern floor after a week of revelry, mixed with a slaughterhouse left to bake under the Mediterranean sun. That was Rome on a good day. In summer, the stench clung to your clothes, your hair, the back of your throat. Even the rich couldn't escape it. They drenched themselves in perfumes, but all that did was add a floral note to the reek of decay. Then there were the animals. Stray dogs nosed through piles of refuse. Rats scurried along the gutters, fat and fearless. Pigs rooted in the muck, the city's unofficial cleanup crew, though they did more scattering than cleaning. And if you thought the streets were bad, wait until it rained. The filth didn't wash away. It turned into a river of sludge that lapped at your ankles. Sandals, a death wish. You'd be lucky to make it home without losing one to the suck of the mire. Now, let's talk about the noise. Rome never slept. Carts rumbled over uneven stones at all hours, their drivers shouting curses at anyone in their way. Blacksmiths hammered, street vendors bellowed, and drunks sang badly long past midnight. There were no quiet corners. Even the wealthy, in their villas, couldn't shut out the din. The poet Juvenal wrote about it, how the clatter of wagons and the shouts of brawlers made sleep impossible. And those brawlers, they were everywhere. Rome had no police force, not like we think of it. If you were rich, you hired bodyguards. If you were poor, you kept your head down and prayed. Street gangs ruled entire neighborhoods, shaking down shopkeepers and brawling over turf. Get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you might wake up in an alley with your purse gone now, or your throat slit. Disease was the great equalizer. The rich died in their beds, the poor died in the streets, but they all died the same way, choked by fever, writhing with dysentery, or rotting from infections. The aqueducts brought fresh water, but the lead pipes poisoned it slowly. The public. Fountains were lifelines, but drink from the wrong one and you'd be clutching your stomach by sundown. Even the baths, those famous symbols of Roman luxury, were petri dishes of bacteria. The water was changed rarely, and everyone, clean or not, soaked in the same murky soup. And then there were the fires. Rome burned, constantly. The cramped wooden apartments, the open flames of oil lamps, the careless cook. It only took a spark. In 64 AD, Nero watched half the city turn to ash, and though he got the blame, fires were a fact of life. If you lived in an insula, those rickety tenements that towered 5-6 stories high, you slept lightly. One shout of "Fire!" and you had minutes to grab what you could and run before the whole block went up like kindling. So no, Rome wasn't the shining marble paradise of history books. It was a beast, beautiful and brutal, where you could be trampled by a senator's litter one moment and pickpocketed the next. Where the smell of baking bread mixed with the stench of an open sewer. where the greatest empire on earth built temples to the gods while its people waded through filth. And this was just the streets, just the start. Because if you thought walking through Rome was bad, wait until you saw where they ate, where they slept, where they went to die. But that's a horror for another chapter. Chapter 2. Slave or Starve, the Brutal Economics of Survival. Rome didn't just have an economy. It had a meat grinder, a relentless system where the gears turned on broken backs and empty stomachs. You either fed the machine or became its fuel. There was no middle ground. At the heart of this machine was slavery, not the peripheral institution we imagine, but the very foundation that kept the empire standing. Walk through any Roman street, and 1 in every 3 people you passed was property, not citizens, not even people in the eyes of the law, just living tools that breathed. The mines of Spain and Sardinia swallowed them by the thousands, where men worked in perpetual darkness until their lungs filled with stone dust. The great latifundia plantations stretched across North Africa, worked by chains of laborers who woke before dawn and collapsed after dusk. Even in the city, every wealthy home had its human inventory: cooks, tutors, hairdressers, and worse. The slave markets near the Temple of Castor buzzed with a grotesque commerce. Buyers inspected teeth like horses, pinched flesh to check for muscle, examined scars to gauge durability. The poet Martial joked about shopping for slaves as one might shop for lamps, testing several before choosing one. But there was nothing funny about the branded foreheads, the auction blocks, or the children torn from parents to serve different masters. A healthy male slave cost about 2,000 sesterces, roughly 2 years' wages for a laborer. A pretty young girl for the bedroom. That could run 5 times as much. For those not in chains, life wasn't much better. The free poor crowded into rickety insulae, those towering death traps that regularly collapsed or burned. A single room might house an entire family, their few possessions hanging from hooks to keep them off the flea-infested floors. The satirist Juvenal described these dwellings as pigeon coops, where tenants lived in constant terror of the roof giving way. And the rent? It devoured half a man's earnings before he'd eaten a single meal. Work was backbreaking when you could get it. Dock workers strained under amphorae of olive oil, their shoulders permanently stooped. Construction laborers mixed mortar, with bare hands until their skin cracked. Porters carried impossible loads up the Aventine Hill for pennies. There were no labor laws, no safety regulations, just a foreman's whip and the cold calculation that there were always more desperate men waiting to take your place. The grain dole was the only thing standing between most plebeians and starvation. Every month, the state distributed free wheat to citizen heads of households. On paper, it was a benevolent system. In reality, it was a calculated bribe. 5 modii, about 33 pounds, of grain just sufficient to keep a man alive and docile. Miss the distribution day because you were sick. Your children went hungry, the grain spoiled. You tightened your belt until the next shipment from Egypt. And woe betide any politician who tampered with this fragile balance. The mob had burned down the Senate House more than once when the grain ships were delayed. For the unlucky ones who fell through even these thin safety nets, there were the gladiator schools or the brothels. Both were just slower forms of execution. A man could sell himself to a ludus and spend his remaining years being hacked apart for crowds' amusement. A girl might auction her body in the Subura's brothels, where the lamps burned all night and the sheets were never changed. The graffiti, still visible in Pompeii, tells their stories in crude scratches. Here I came, I fucked, I left. No romance, no dignity, just the commerce of flesh. Meanwhile, the rich grew fatter. A senator's income could exceed 1 million sesterces annually, enough to feed thousands. They built villas with heated floors and piped water, while the poor drank from public fountains. They ate dormice glazed in honey, while beggars fought for mouldy bread crusts. The historian Seneca described one feast where live birds were released from pies, another where guests were given silver shovels to dig for oysters buried in mounds of salt. All while just outside the dining room, slaves stood ready to catch vomit between courses. This was Rome's dirty secret. Its splendor was built on a mountain of human suffering. The marble temples and paved roads, slave labor, the lavish banquets, slave service. Even the intellectual class relied on educated Greek slaves to tutor their children. The entire system functioned because an underclass of millions had no choice but to keep it running. And the cruelest joke of all, the hope that kept the machine turning. The slave who saved every sesterce to buy his freedom, the laborer who dreamed of a lucky break, the prostitute who prayed for a rich patron. Because in Rome, everyone believed they were just one big score, away from joining the privileged few, even as the wheels of the machine ground them to dust. But for those who actually made it into the elite circles, life took an even darker turn. Behind those gilded doors lay a world of paranoia, poison, and political backstabbing that made the slums look tame. But that's a story for the powerful and their victims. Chapter 3. Blood and Spectacle, the Colosseum's Carnival of Death. The roar of the crowd hit like a physical force, a wall of sound that vibrated through your ribs as you entered the Flavian amphitheater. Above you, the awning strained against its ropes, casting dappled shadows across 50,000 screaming Romans. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine mixed with something sharper, sweat, fear, and the iron tang of blood soaking into sand. This wasn't entertainment. This was ritual sacrifice dressed in imperial purple. The games began at dawn with the venations, animal hunts that transformed the arena into a twisted paradise. Exotic beasts from the farthest corners of the empire paced in wooden cages beneath. The stands, North African lions with matted manes, their paws raw from shipdecks. Bears from Germania, starved for days to make them vicious. Leopards from Syria, their spotted coats twitching with nervous energy. The handlers prodded them toward trapdoors that led to the arena floor, where condemned criminals waited in rags. You could always tell the first-timers. They still screamed when the lions came. The veterans stood silent, conserving their strength for a hopeless fight. The crowd cheered as a tawny lioness dragged a screaming man by his thigh, his fingers clawing bloody streaks in the sand. Children in the front rows pointed and laughed as a bear disemboweled a thief with one swipe of its claws. This wasn't just punishment, it was theater. When a particularly brave or foolish convict managed to stab a leopard through the heart, the mob roared its approval until the next beast was released to finish the job. By mid-morning, the sand was sticky with blood and entrails. Teams of slaves raked it smooth between acts, their bare feet leaving prints in the gore. The smell grew thicker now, a butcher shop reek that clung to your clothes and hair. Vendors circulated with cups of posca, that vinegary soldier's drink, to settle queasy stomachs, while bookmakers took bets on how many men the next bear would kill. The executions came next, the meridiani. These weren't quick deaths. Romans understood the art of suffering. You might see a reenactment of the myth of Laureolus, where a criminal played the part of the bandit crucified on stage, except this wasn't pretend. The nails were real. The blood was real. As the actor twitched on his cross, professional mourners wailed in mock grief, drawing laughter from the stands. Other condemned men were sewn into animal skins and set loose for hunting dogs to tear apart. The crowd particularly loved the Furies, women dressed as mythological vengeance spirits who tortured prisoners with red-hot irons. But all this was merely the appetizer. The gladiators entered at high noon, to fanfares of trumpets. These weren't the Hollywood heroes of legend. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or desperate volunteers who'd sworn the dread oath, "I will endure burning, imprisonment, beating, and death by the sword." Their armor gleamed in the sunlight, each piece carefully designed to protect just enough to prolong the fight without preventing mortal wounds. The retiarius, with his trident and net, fought bare-chested, his only protection a single armored sleeve. The Mamillo's fish-crested helmet limited his vision to what was directly ahead. The fights began with ritual precision. The combatants saluted the editor, the game's sponsor, with the famous cry, "Those who are about to die salute you." But contrary to popular myth, most didn't die. A good gladiator was a substantial investment, trained for years at great expense. The lanista, trainer who owned him, expected a return on that investment. The real butchery was reserved for the noxi, criminals and prisoners given cheap weapons and sent out to die in mass battles. Yet death still came often enough. When a fighter fell wounded, the crowd would erupt in shouts. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Historians still debate what the gestures meant, but the outcome was always the same, either mercy or a final blade to the throat. The victor stood over his opponent's body as an attendant dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, tested the fallen man with a hot iron to ensure he wasn't faking. If he stirred, a hammer blow to the skull finished the job. The afternoon brought the star attractions, the legendary battles that would be talked about for years. Here the emperor himself might intervene, sparing a particularly brave fighter or ordering a cowardly one butchered in some inventive way. Caligula once had a gladiator's eyes sewn shut so he'd swing wildly at empty air until exhausted. Nero favored theatrical drownings in a flooded arena. As the sun dipped toward the western arches, the final act began, the damnatio ad bestias. Christians weren't the only victims, though later writers would focus on them. Common criminals, rebellious, slaves, and political prisoners all faced the beasts. Some were tied to posts, while lions gnawed their legs. Others were dressed in animal skins and set alight as human torches. The crowd particularly enjoyed watching elephants crush men slowly underfoot. By dusk, the sand was a patchwork of dark stains. The bodies had been dragged away by hooks, no dignified burials for the executed. The wealthy patrons departed through covered walkways discussing dinner plans. The poor filed out through vomitoria, still buzzing about the day's highlights. And beneath the arena, the surviving gladiators returned to their cells, where the winners received medical care. The physician Galen trained on gladiator wounds, and the losers' bodies were stripped of armor and tossed in the pauper's pit. This wasn't mindless violence. It was carefully choreographed social control. The games reminded every citizen, from senator to slave, of Rome's absolute power over life and death. They reinforced hierarchies. They distracted from hunger and injustice. And most importantly, they made the populace complicit in the bloodshed. When 50,000 people cheer a man's death, they become invested in the system that delivers it. The Colosseum's true horror wasn't the deaths themselves, but how eagerly Rome embraced them, how mothers brought children to watch, how lovers held hands while men screamed, how ordinary people, bakers, clerks, shopkeepers, developed a taste for suffering that no amount of blood could satisfy. And in the shadows beneath the stands, the beasts waited for next time. Always next time. Chapter 4. The Butcher's Art, Roman Medicine Between Genius and Barbarism. The screams began before dawn at the temple of Asclepius. Not the cries of the faithful praying for healing, but the ragged shrieks of men being held down on stone slabs as a surgeon probed their wounds with unwashed hands. This was Roman medicine, a grotesque carnival where brilliant anatomical insights collided with almost comical brutality, where a man might survive a battlefield wound only to die from his physician's cure. At its best, Roman medical practice represented a quantum leap beyond the superstitious bleatings of earlier civilizations. The army's field surgeons could extract arrows with ingenious spoon-shaped probes, suture severed arteries with linen thread, and even perform trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure from head wounds. The famous physician Galen, building on Greek knowledge, correctly identified that blood moved through arteries, though he wrongly believed the liver manufactured it. Roman medical tools excavated at Pompeii, bone saws, scalpels, vaginal speculums, show a chilling precision in their craftsmanship. But for every moment of genius, there were 100 of butchery. Take the standard cure for fever, bleeding. The theory of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, dictated that illness resulted from imbalance. So physicians opened veins, sometimes draining pints at a time from already weakened patients. The esteemed doctor, Aulus Cornelius Celsus, recommended bleeding until the patient fainted, a sure sign the excess humours had been evacuated. Malaria. Victims, already anemic from their disease, often didn't survive the treatment. Childbirth became a horrifying roulette. Wealthy women might have access to Greek-trained midwives who understood anatomy, but most Roman mothers laboured attended only by female relatives and local wise women armed with folk remedies. When complications arose, the solutions were medieval: crushed pearls in wine to stop hemorrhaging, pigeon dung applied to the vulva to strengthen contractions, or, in desperate cases, the use of bronze hooks to extract a dead fetus piece by piece. The poet Lucretius described one such scene where the midwife's hands slipped in blood up to the wrist. Maternal mortality likely exceeded 25% per birth, explaining why some Roman tombstones list women dead at 20 after 5 or 6 pregnancies. Then there were the medicines themselves. Roman pharmacology mixed startling efficacy with lethal absurdity. Willow bark tea, containing salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, genuinely relieved pain, while the same practitioner might prescribe a paste of crushed earthworms and boar's dung for liver ailments. Lead-based cosmetics poisoned aristocratic women slowly, while their doctors prescribed lead powder for digestive troubles. The famous antidote Mithridatium contained over 50 ingredients, including opium and chopped vipers. It probably worked largely because the opium made patients too high to care they were dying. Dentistry epitomized this dichotomy. Archaeologists have found Roman skulls with gold bridgework so sophisticated it wouldn't be replicated until the 19th century, right beside others where rotten teeth had been yanked out with pliers, taking chunks of jawbone with them. The poet Martial joked about a dentist named Pantagathus, all pain, whose extractions could be heard 3 streets away. For toothaches, the standard remedy involved fumigation, stuffing the patient's mouth with burning henbane seeds until the toxic smoke either killed the nerve or the patient. Mental illness received even cruder treatment. Melancholics, depressives, were bled, purged, and plunged into ice baths. Epileptics were thought possessed, so physicians prescribed prayers alongside a regimen of drinking gladiators' blood for its vital force. The worst cases ended up chained in dark rooms, their food pushed through slots like animals. The philosopher Seneca described visiting one such clinic where the mad tore at their own flesh with fingernails grown long as claws. Surgery without anesthesia became an art form of suffering. Patients were held down by burly slaves while the surgeon worked. Cauterization meant pressing white-hot irons directly into wounds. Amputations required a swift soaring motion, too slow, and the patient would die from shock, too fast, and the stump would be too ragged to heal. The survival rate for battlefield amputations may have been as high as 50%, but only because the strongest patients were selected for the procedure in the first place. The baths, those famous temples of Roman hygiene, ironically became vectors of disease. The warm, stagnant water in public pools bred bacteria that caused everything from eye infections to gangrene. The scraping strigil may have removed dirt, but when used communally, it spread skin diseases like wildfire. Even the vaunted Roman aqueducts carried water through lead pipes that slowly poisoned entire neighborhoods with neurological damage. Perhaps most chilling was the medical profession's complete lack of oversight. Anyone could call themselves a physician. The satirist Lucian tells of one doctor whose entire practice consisted of two treatments: vinegar enemas for everything above the waist and honey suppositories for everything below. When patients died, as they frequently did, there were no consequences, just a shrug and the old Latin saying medice curata ipsum, physician, heal thyself. Yet for all its horrors, Roman medicine wasn't static. Military doctors like Dioscorides compiled detailed herbals that distinguished between effective and poisonous plants. Galen's experiments on live animals, mostly pigs, advanced understanding of anatomy despite the ethical nightmare. And the valetudinaria, military hospitals along the frontiers, developed protocols for wound care and sanitation that likely saved thousands of lives. The true tragedy lay in the uneven application of this knowledge. An aristocrat with a skilled Greek doctor might survive a serious illness, while his slaves died like flies from the same condition. The legions benefited from organized medical corps, while civilians relied on quacks and charms. It was a system where chance played as big a role as science in whether you lived or died. As the empire declined, so did its medical knowledge. Texts were lost, techniques forgotten. The elaborate field hospitals of the legions gave way to medieval barber surgeons who could barely read. It would take over 1,000 years for Western medicine to regain the level of sophistication achieved, however inconsistently, in Rome's heyday. And perhaps that's the most Roman thing of all, having the brilliance to see the path forward, but lacking the will to follow it consistently, building aqueducts that carried poison, developing surgical tools that were used to hack rather than heal, creating a medical system that could either save your life or end it prematurely, depending entirely on who you were and who you could afford. In the end, Roman medicine mirrored Roman society itself, advanced yet brutal, enlightened yet superstitious, capable of both astonishing compassion and casual cruelty, just like the empire that created it. Chapter 5. Legions of the Damned, the meat grinder of Roman warfare. The recruit stood barefoot on the cracked earth of the training field, his newly issued caligae, those brutal nail-studded sandals, already rubbing his feet raw. At 20, he was prime legionary material, strong back, weak mind, and just desperate enough to swear the sacramentum, the oath that would bind him to Rome for the next 25 years. Not that he knew what 25 years meant yet. Not really. The centurion's vine staff cracked against his shoulder. "You belong to Caesar now, boy." And so he did. The Roman war machine didn't run on patriotism or ideology. It ran on broken men and clever logistics. That recruit would soon learn the first truth of legionary life. The army was designed to grind you down and rebuild you as something else, something harder. The training regimen would have broken modern special forces candidates. 30-mile forced marches in full kit, 60 pounds minimum, swimming across rivers in armor, digging practice camps every night, only to dismantle them at dawn. And the weapons drills, hour after hour of stabbing the wooden post until blisters became calluses, until the gladius felt like an extension of your arm. The centurions weren't teaching these men to fight. They were teaching them to kill without thinking. Discipline was maintained through a system of punishments so inventive they'd make a torturer blush. The fustuarium, a man beaten to death by his own comrades for falling asleep on watch. Decimation. 1 in 10 men clubbed to death by their 9 fellows for cowardice. Lesser infractions earned floggings that left backs ribboned with scars. The historian Polybius described seeing men who'd been corrected so often their shoulders were permanently hunched from anticipating blows. Yet this brutality produced soldiers who could march in perfect formation while arrows rained down, who could hold a shield wall until ordered to break, who would charge into certain death because the alternative, Roman justice, was worse. The real genius lay in the logistics. While barbarian hordes starved or scattered each winter, the legions built fortified camps with mathematical precision. Surveyors marched ahead of the army, marking out streets and command tents before the first shovel struck dirt. Prefab wooden towers rose within hours. Latrines were dug downstream from water sources. Field hospitals, the valetudinaria, operated. With startling efficiency, their instruments boiled in vinegar, their surgeons trained to prioritize wounds by severity. A wounded legionary had better odds than a medieval knight 5 centuries later. But make no mistake, this was no noble profession. The average legionary saw more rape than glory. When cities fell, the men were given free rein for days. Josephus describes the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Streets running ankle-deep in blood, women dragged screaming from temple altars, children tossed onto burning piles of loot. The famous Trajan's column shows smiling Romans leading Dacian women and children into slavery, as if it were some cheerful parade. Every soldier knew his pension would come from the sale of human beings. Disease killed more men than battle. Damp British outposts rotted men's lungs with pneumonia. Egyptian garrisons watched helplessly as dysentery turned their bowels to water. The eastern frontiers simmered with malaria that turned strong men yellow and shaking. And always, the parasites. Worms from bad water, lice that carried typhus, fleas that spread plague. Archaeologists find more legionary graves near bathhouses than battlefields. The weapons themselves were brutally efficient. The gladius wasn't some elegant dueling sword. It was a butcher's tool, optimized for stabbing guts in tight formations. The pilum, javelin, was designed to bend on impact, rendering shields useless, and the scutum, that curved rectangular shield, wasn't just protection. It was a weapon, used to bash faces as the short sword went to work below. Roman tactics favored the grind over the flashy charge. Let the barbarians exhaust themselves against the testudo, tortoise formation, then methodically slaughter them when they tired. Siege warfare showed Rome at its most ingeniously cruel. At Masada, they built a ramp 300 feet high to breach a mountain fortress. At Alesia, Caesar constructed concentric walls to trap both the city and its relief force. The ballistae could launch flaming projectiles with terrifying accuracy, but the real psychological weapon was time. A besieged city would watch helplessly as the legions built their circumvallation, that inexorable ring of death. Knowing escape was impossible. Then came the starvation, then the cannibalism, then finally the mercy of Roman swords. The navy was even worse. Rowers weren't slaves, contrary to popular myth, but they might as well have been. Chained to their benches during battle, they pulled oars in sweltering heat until their hands bled. If the ship went down, they drowned in chains. Marines fought on slippery decks with no room for formations, just brutal hand-to-hand butchery, where the loser went overboard to sink in his armor. And for what? The pay was laughable. About 300 sesterces a year under Augustus, barely enough to buy decent armor. The retirement package? A plot of land in some godforsaken frontier province if you lived that long. Most didn't. The average legionary had a 1 in 4 chance of dying during service, higher in active war zones. Their tombstones tell the story. Lived 30 years, served 12, died in the Second Dacian War. No glory, just dates. Yet men still enlisted. The poor saw it as escape from crushing poverty. The dispossessed hoped for citizenship, granted after 25 years. The truly desperate volunteered just for regular meals. And they kept coming, generation after generation, to march under the eagle standards. Because the secret truth was this: the Roman army wasn't just conquering the world, it was creating Romans. Gauls, Germans, Spaniards, all could become legionaries, then citizens, then in some cases even emperors. The barracks were the empire's true melting pot. The legions' greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was in the minds of the conquered. By the 2nd century AD, barbarian chiefs were giving their sons Roman names and sending them to serve as officers. The very people Rome had subjugated now fought to preserve the system that had broken them. No empire before or since achieved such complete psychological domination. That recruit from the first paragraph, if he survived his first battle, a big if, he'd wake up the next morning changed. The stink of blood and voided bowels would never quite leave his nose. The weight of his chainmail would feel like home. And when they handed him his share of loot, a silver coin, a slave girl, maybe a decent sword, he'd understand the real lesson. Rome didn't pay its soldiers in money. It paid them in cruelty, and once you acquired a taste for it, nothing else would satisfy. The frontier never slept. Somewhere, always, there was another river to cross, another hill fought to storm, another rebellious tribe to crucify along the roadside. The legions marched on through dust and snow, their hobnailed sandals wearing grooves in the bones of the world. And behind them came the tax collectors, the bureaucrats, the slave traders, the real victors of every Roman war. But for those who served, there was only the next march, the next battle, the next chance to prove that they, the expendable ones, were in fact the steel spine of empire, until the day the spine finally snapped. Chapter 6. The Imperial Meat Grinder, when Rome ate its own. The stench of burning flesh still clung to the forum months after the last executions. Not the clean smoke of sacrificial altars, but the greasy, lingering reek of human fat rendering. Over coals. This was what happened when emperors turned paranoid, when the greatest empire in the world became a snake devouring its own tail. The same legions that had pacified 3 continents now marched against Roman cities. The same courts that had dispensed justice now fabricated charges over dinner. And the same streets that had once bustled with commerce now ran slick with senatorial. Blood after another purge. Rome's political machinery had always been brutal, but under the emperors, it became a death trap with gilded walls. The Principate, Augustus's clever fiction of restored republicanism, slowly rotted into naked despotism. Emperors justified their excesses by pointing to external threats, but the real danger had always been internal. The Praetorian Guard, originally formed as an elite protection detail, quickly realized they held the real power. Why guard an emperor when you could auction his throne to the highest bidder? In 193 AD, they did exactly that, killing Pertinax, and offering the empire to Didius Julianus like a prize hog at market. The Senate, those venerable old men who had once ruled the Mediterranean, now convened to rubber-stamp whatever the latest strongman demanded. The methods of control grew, increasingly baroque. Caligula, that golden-haired monster, made senators run beside his chariot like slaves. Nero forced aristocrats to perform on stage, a social death worse than execution. Domitian lined the roads to his palace with crucifixes so visitors would understand the stakes. But the true horror lay in the bureaucracy, the endless paperwork of death. A man could be going about his business one morning when an imperial freedman arrived with a scroll listing his name among the condemned. No trial, no appeal, just the cold efficiency of state terror. Wealthy families kept poison rings handy for such occasions. The unlucky ones watched as their property was confiscated, their wives and children sold into slavery. their names chiseled from monuments in damnatio memoriae. The provinces fared no better. Governors appointed for their loyalty rather than competent squeezed populations dry. Tax farmers, backed by soldiers, stripped entire regions bare. When Boudicca's rebellion erupted in Britain, it wasn't just due to Roman brutality. It was the final straw after years of financial rape. Loans from Roman bankers at crushing interest, grain requisitions that left families starving, and the casual sexual predation of occupying forces. The revolt's ferocity shocked Rome not because it was unjustified, but because the empire had grown so accustomed to submission. The military, once the guarantor of stability, became its greatest threat. Legionaries stationed for decades on the frontiers developed more loyalty to their generals than to some distant emperor. The year of the four emperors, 69 AD, saw rival armies marching on Rome itself, each battle fought with the same discipline that had conquered Gaul, now turned inward. At Cremona, legionaries who had once stood shoulder to shield against barbarians butchered each other with mechanical efficiency. The historian Tacitus described veterans recognizing former comrades in the chaos and killing them anyway, too numb to care. The economy mirrored this rot. Constant warfare drained the treasury, while emperors debased the currency to pay the troops. Silver denarii became copper slugs dipped in thin silver wash. Price controls imposed by Diocletian only drove trade underground. The once vibrant merchant class collapsed under the weight of taxes and insecurity. And always the slaves. New. Shipments from conquered territories propping up a system that should have collapsed under its own weight. Religion morphed into another tool of control. The imperial cult demanded worship of living emperors as gods, a useful way to smoke out dissenters. Christians weren't persecuted for their beliefs so much as their refusal to participate in this state theater. Their martyrdoms became propaganda, pieces, proof that Rome still had teeth. Yet even this backfired as the martyrs' defiance inspired more converts than fear. The rot seeped into every aspect of life. Literature degenerated from Cicero's eloquence to sycophantic panegyrics, praising emperors' mediocre poetry. Architecture grew gaudy as substance gave way to spectacle. Domitian's 150-foot golden palace doors, mocking the modest homes of starving plebs. Even the gladiatorial games grew stale, requiring ever more exotic executions to sate the crowds. Jaded appetites. And through it all the people adapted. They always did. Black markets flourished, bribes greased the wheels of justice, the wealthy built secret escape tunnels from their homes, the poor learned to keep their heads down and mouths shut. Rome had survived madness before, Caligula's reign of terror, Nero's pyromania, Commodus's gladiator fantasies, but each crisis left the system weaker. The cruelest joke? Rome's enemies knew. Gothic chieftains, serving as imperial generals, saw the decay firsthand. Persian ambassadors returned home with reports of crumbling frontiers. Even the humblest border tribes sensed the empire's growing fragility beneath its marble veneer. Yet life continued. Markets opened at dawn. Bakers baked bread. Children played in the streets. Though now they reenacted not heroic battles, but executions. The machinery of state ground on through inertia alone. Tax collectors still demanded payment, even as the silver coins they collected were worthless. Recruiters still pressed men into legions that hadn't been paid in months. The baths still opened daily, though the water ran brown with neglect. This was the empire's final phase, not conquest, not consolidation, but slow-motion suicide. The same roads that had carried legions outward now brought invaders in. The same walls that had protected cities became prisons during sieges. And the same people who had once believed in Rome's eternal destiny now whispered about omens, comets, earthquakes, the Tiber running red with silt that looked disturbingly like blood. The lesson was clear enough for those who dared see it. No system built on endless expansion and institutionalized cruelty could sustain itself forever. The barbarians at the gates weren't the cause of Rome's fall. They were merely the undertakers, arriving after the patient had already expired. And in the imperial palace, surrounded by sycophants and paranoid guards, the latest emperor, whoever he was this week, stared at his reflection in a polished silver plate, wondering when the knives would come for him, just as he had sent them for so many others. The wheel kept turning, until one day it didn't. Chapter 7. The Rot Within. How Rome's Heart Turned to Poison. The butcher's bill always came due. After centuries of conquest, after mountains of plundered gold and rivers of enslaved humanity, Rome's greatest enemy wasn't the barbarians pounding at the gates. It was the slow, creeping sickness that had been festering inside its own walls since the days of glory. The same systems that had built the empire now conspired to strangle it. The same roads that had carried wealth into the capital now carried plague. The same bureaucracy that had administered provinces now suffocated innovation under layers of graft. And the same people who had once marched proudly as citizens now shuffled through the streets as hollow-eyed survivors, wondering when the next disaster would strike. The money ran out first, not with a crash, but with a slow, sickening slide. By the 3rd century, the denarius, once a coin of pure silver, had become a copper joke dipped in metallic paint. Emperors kept debasing the currency to pay the ever-growing army. Each reduction in precious metal content, another lie told to the populace. Shopkeepers grew wary, then furious, then resigned as prices doubled, then tripled, then became meaningless. Diocletian's infamous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD didn't stabilize the economy. It simply drove commerce underground. A black market in honest weights and measures flourished, while official storehouses stood empty. Soldiers demanded payment in kind, grain, oil, whatever would hold value, and woe to the farmer who couldn't deliver. The land itself grew exhausted. Latifundia, those vast slave-worked plantations that had enriched the senatorial class, now sat half fallow, the soil depleted by centuries of monocropping. North Africa, once the empire's breadbasket, showed alarming signs of desertification as Roman irrigation techniques backfired, leaving behind salt-choked fields. Peasant farmers, crushed under taxes and conscription, abandoned their plots to join roving bands of Bagaudae, part brigands, part proto-revolutionaries. The more land that fell out of production, the heavier the burden grew on what remained, creating a death spiral of agricultural collapse. Disease walked hand in hand with famine. The Antonine Plague of 165 AD, likely smallpox brought back from Mesopotamia, killed perhaps a quarter of the empire's population. The Cyprian Plague, a century later, finished what its predecessor started. Corpses piled so high in Alexandria that they blocked the streets. In Rome, mass graves outside the city swallowed thousands without ceremony. The epidemics didn't just kill people, they shattered the delicate mechanisms of state. Tax revenues plummeted, armies struggled to fill their ranks. Entire villages disappeared from the records, their fields returning to wilderness. The surviving laborers, now acutely aware of their value, began demanding better terms, an early whisper of the feudalism to come. The army, once Rome's pride, became its parasite. Where legions had previously been stationed at the frontiers, emperors now scattered them across the interior to put down rebellions and enforce tax collection. These soldiers were no longer citizen farmers serving short terms, but professional mercenaries loyal only to their paymasters. Barbarians filled the ranks, bringing their own customs and allegiances. By the time of Stilicho, the half-Vandal general who became the empire's de facto ruler in the late 4th century, The Roman military was a patchwork of Gothic, Hun, and Frankish warbands who barely understood Latin. They defended Rome not out of patriotism, but because it was the last institution capable of paying them. The cities emptied, aqueducts cracked without repair, theaters stood empty. Public baths, those great social equalizers, became breeding grounds for disease rather than discourse. As urban life grew more dangerous and less profitable, the wealthy retreated to fortified country villas, taking what remained of culture and capital with them. The middle class, once Rome's backbone, slipped into poverty or fled beyond imperial control. What remained in the cities were the desperately poor, the politically connected, and those with nowhere else to go. The graffiti at Pompeii took on a haunting new tone, not the cheerful obscenities of earlier centuries, but pleas to saints and strange new gods for protection. The government's response: more government. Each crisis spawned new bureaucracies that created new problems, requiring more bureaucracies. By the time of the Notitia Dignitatum, a sprawling 4th century administrative document, the empire had more officials than it had functioning cities to govern. Tax collectors employed their own armed enforcers. Grain distributors kept double ledgers. Provincial governors sold offices to the highest bidders, who then had to recoup their investments through graft. The law became so convoluted that entire schools of jurists devoted themselves to navigating contradictions between imperial edicts. Justice wasn't blind. She was smothered under paperwork. Religion, once a unifying force, became another fault line. The rise of Christianity didn't so much replace the old gods as expose the empire's spiritual bankruptcy. Traditional Roman religion had always been transactional, sacrifice to get favors. But as disasters mounted, people craved meaning beyond mere ritual. The Christian promise of salvation appealed not because it was true, but because it was the only narrative that made sense of the suffering. Yet even this new faith quickly became politicized. The Arian controversy, the Donatist schism, the persecution of pagans, each conflict further divided an empire that desperately needed unity. When Constantine converted, he didn't bring spiritual renewal. He created a state church as corruptible as any other institution. The barbarians weren't invading, they were being invited. Gothic tribes fleeing the Huns didn't want to destroy Rome, they wanted to join it. But imperial bureaucracy handled these migrations with stunning incompetence. At Adrianople in 378 AD, Roman officials starved and cheated Gothic refugees until they revolted, killing Emperor Valens and destroying 2/3 of the Eastern army. Later, Federati treaties settled barbarian tribes inside imperial borders, but failed to assimilate them, creating enemy enclaves that maintained their own laws and leaders. By 410, when Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome itself, they weren't foreign conquerors. They were disgruntled former auxiliaries collecting back pay the only way they could. The West didn't fall. It atrophied. There was no single catastrophic collapse, just 1,000 small failures compounding daily. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, wasn't overthrown in battle. He was pensioned off by the barbarian general Odoacer in 476 AD. The Senate kept meeting for decades afterward, not realizing its authority had evaporated. In outlying provinces, people barely noticed the change. Tax collectors still came, just under new management. Roman roads now carried Germanic warbands instead of legions, but the wheels of commerce kept turning, just with more armed escorts. The tragedy wasn't that Rome fell. The tragedy was how long it took to die. Long after the political structures collapsed, Roman habits persisted. Latin remained the language of law and learning. The Church preserved administrative techniques along with theology. Barbarian kings minted coins with imperial portraits, not because anyone believed in them, but because they couldn't conceive of another system. The eastern half of the empire would cling to the fiction of Roman continuity for another 1,000 years, even as Greek replaced Latin and Caesars became Basileus. In the west, the ruins told their own story. The Colosseum became a quarry. The Forum reverted to pasture land. Aqueducts provided shelter for shepherds rather than water for cities. And yet, in the laws, in the roads, in the very shape of thought, Rome's ghost lingered. The medieval world would spend centuries trying to resurrect that ghost, never quite understanding that what made Rome remarkable wasn't its longevity, but its ability to convince generations that decline wasn't already happening. The lesson whispered through those. Crumbling ruins wasn't about barbarians or battles or even corruption. It was about the slow, inevitable consequence of any system that mistakes stability for permanence, that confuses ritual with vitality, that cannot imagine its own irrelevance until the bill collector is already at the door. Rome didn't fall because it grew weak. It grew weak because it refused to admit it could fall. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Ghosts of Empire in a Broken World. The silence was the first thing they noticed. No more trumpets sounding dawn watch across the camp. No more clerks scratching census rolls in provincial offices. No more auctioneers crying bids in the slave markets. Just an eerie quiet where the machinery of empire had once thundered. The people who had lived their entire lives under the weight and wonder of Rome now wandered through its corpse, picking at the bones without understanding what they had lost or gained. The roads still stretched across continents, but now they carried different travelers. Monks moved along the old Roman highways with manuscripts hidden in their robes, smuggling knowledge from one crumbling monastery to another. Bandits lurked in the pine forests that had grown up along neglected stretches, preying on what little traffic remained. And always, always, the barbarians, except now they weren't invaders but kings. Men like Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who ruled Italy from Ravenna with the careful imitation of a child wearing his father's armor, issuing laws in Latin while his warriors spoke gutter German. The cities told the story of collapse in stone and weeds. Rome itself shrank from 1 million souls to perhaps 30,000, its population clustered along the Tiber, where the old aqueducts still dripped rather than flowed. The Forum became the Campo Vaccino, the cow field, where shepherds grazed their flocks between toppled columns. Senators still met in theory, but their debates concerned nothing more consequential than next year's wine harvest. In Britain, the great villas, with their mosaic floors and hypocaust heating, were abandoned so completely that later generations believed fairies had built them. Along the Rhine, frontier towns that had thrived on military pay became ghost towns, their amphitheaters repurposed as makeshift fortresses against newer, hungrier invaders. Yet life stubbornly continued. In the countryside, former colony, tenant, farmers who had been bound to the land under Diocletian's reforms found themselves becoming the nucleus of medieval serfdom. Their obligations didn't vanish with the empire, they simply transferred to new masters. The difference was one, of scale. Where once they had sent their surplus to feed 1 million mouths in Rome, now they provisioned a local warlord's hall. The rhythm of planting and harvest remained, but the horizon of their world shrank from imperial to insular. The church emerged as Rome's most unexpected heir. Bishops, once minor functionaries in the imperial bureaucracy, now found themselves the only literate authorities left. They negotiated with barbarian kings, organized grain distributions during famines, and preserved what scraps of Roman law still served their purposes. The papacy, originally just another bishopric, began its slow transformation into a sovereign power, part spiritual, part temporal, by filling the vacuum left by absent emperors. Gregory the Great, watching Lombards camp outside Rome's walls, in the 590s, didn't just pray for deliverance. He raised armies, paid ransoms, and essentially governed as the last Roman in Italy. But the church's inheritance was a poisoned chalice. The same corruption that had rotted the secular state now infected ecclesiastical offices. Bishoprics became political prizes fought over by noble families. Relics, real and forged, became a booming trade with enough splinters of the true cross to build a ship. Monastic scribes preserved Virgil and Cicero alongside theological texts, but their quills also recorded the growing list of superstitions and folk magic that seeped into Christian practice. The Venerable Bede, writing in 8th century Northumbria, could still access Roman histories, but his worldview had more in common with the Druids his ancestors had feared than with Tacitus or Livy. Language itself fragmented. Vulgar Latin birthed. 1,000 dialects from Portugal to Romania, the lingua franca of empire, dissolved into regional tongues that would one day become Italian, French, Spanish. In Britain, the Celtic languages Rome had suppressed came roaring back, only to be supplanted, again by Anglo-Saxon. The very words changed meaning. Imperium became something wistful and half-remembered. Libertas now meant privilege rather than citizenship, and barbarous ceased to be an insult as former barbarians wrote the laws. The Eastern Empire watched the West's disintegration with horrified fascination. Constantinople still called itself Roman, but its Greek-speaking emperors presided over a fundamentally different civilization. Justinian's desperate reconquest of Italy in the 6th century proved a Pyrrhic victory, draining the treasury for lands that slipped away within generations. The Codex Justinianus preserved Roman law even as the last Latin speakers died out in the imperial court. By the time of Basil II in the 11th century, the Byzantines viewed Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire as a grotesque parody, a sentiment the Germans returned when they saw the effete Constantinopolitans with their eunuchs and endless theological debates. The material world regressed in ways both dramatic and mundane. Pottery became cruder without large-scale kilns to maintain standards. Roof tiles gave way to thatch as the knowledge of large-scale brickmaking faded. Coinage became rare outside major trading centers, with most transactions reverting to barter. The intricate network of imperial post stations collapsed, making news travel at the speed of a horse rather than an organized courier system. A letter from Paris to Rome might take months instead of weeks if it arrived at all. Yet amid the ruins, innovation persisted in unexpected places. The heavy plough, once unnecessary in the Mediterranean's thin soils, revolutionized agriculture in northern Europe. Watermills proliferated without imperial bureaucrats to monopolize their use. The stirrup, introduced by Avars and Lombards, changed warfare more profoundly than any Roman tactical reform. Even feudalism, often portrayed as a backward step, provided localized stability where empire-wide systems had failed. The medieval world was being born in Rome's corpse, midwifed by necessity. The greatest irony. Many barbarian kingdoms worked harder to maintain Roman traditions than the later emperors had. The Visigothic Liber Judiciorum borrowed heavily from Theodosian law. Burgundian kings employed Roman tax collectors. Even Viking raiders, when they settled in Normandy, adopted Frankish customs that were themselves bastardized Roman remnants. The dream of empire proved more durable than its reality. What truly died wasn't the Roman way of life, but the belief in its inevitability. Generations had lived under the assumption that Rome was eternal, that crises might come and go, but the system itself was as fixed as the stars. The collapse shattered that certainty, leaving behind a world where nothing could be taken for granted. Kings rose and fell in decades rather than centuries. Borders shifted with each marriage alliance or battle. The very concept of civilization became fluid and contested. And yet, in the monasteries, in the law codes, in the stubborn persistence of Roman roads and aqueducts still used centuries later, the ghost of empire lingered. Not as a presence, but as an absence, a shape where something monumental had once stood. The Middle Ages would spend centuries trying to reconstruct that shape, never quite recapturing the original, but creating something new in the attempt. Rome didn't disappear. It dissolved into the groundwater of history, poisoning and nourishing everything that grew after. The barbarians didn't destroy the empire. They became its inheritors, then its eulogists, and finally its reinventors. What emerged from the ruins wasn't Roman, nor wholly alien, but something stranger, a world that remembered just enough to know what it had lost, and forgot just enough to imagine it could be rebuilt. The last lesson of Rome was the hardest. Civilizations don't fall. They unravel one thread at a time until one day people look around and realize the fabric is gone, and by then it's always too late to reweave it. Chapter 9. The Long Shadow, Rome's ghost in the machine of history. The parchment crackled as the monk's quill scratched across its surface, each stroke an act of quiet rebellion against the darkness gathering beyond the monastery walls. Here in this cold scriptorium, on the edge of what had once been Roman Britain, a lone scribe copied out Cicero's speeches while barbarian kingdoms rose and fell outside. He didn't know why he preserved these words. No living soul within 100. Miles could read them with understanding. Yet still he wrote, as if the very act might summon back the light of a world that had vanished centuries before his birth. This was Rome's afterlife, not in marble or legions, but in the stubborn echoes that refused to die. The myth of Rome's fall obscured its strange, stubborn persistence. For while the political entity collapsed, its ghost continued to haunt every aspect of medieval life. Charlemagne's coronation in 800 AD as Emperor of the Romans wasn't mere theatre. It was the culmination of 3 centuries of barbarian kings playing dress-up with imperial trappings. His scribes wrote in a Latin so artificially archaic it would have made Caesar wince. His architects attempted and failed to replicate Roman concrete. Even his legal reforms borrowed heavily from Justinian's code, itself a fossilized attempt to preserve classical law. The Carolingian Renaissance, for all its genuine achievements, was fundamentally an exercise in necromancy, an attempt to resurrect a corpse whose bones had already scattered across Europe. The Church became Rome's most successful afterlife. When Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown on Charlemagne's head, he wasn't just sanctifying a new ruler, he was completing the Church's centuries-long takeover of Roman imperial ideology. The Latin Mass preserved the cadences of senatorial oratory. Canon law adopted Roman legal principles. Even the Vatican's administrative structure mirrored the old imperial bureaucracy, with bishops as provincial governors and the Pope as a spiritual emperor. This wasn't coincidence, it was conscious mimicry. By the time of Gregory VII in the 11th century, the papacy openly claimed the right to depose kings, a power even the Caesars had rarely exercised so boldly. Language told its own story of loss and reinvention. The vulgar Latin spoken by Roman soldiers and merchants didn't disappear. It shattered into 1,000 fragments that would eventually become the Romance languages. But the process was neither clean nor uniform. In isolated mountain valleys, shepherds preserved archaic forms that scholars would later mine for clues to classical pronunciation. In port cities, Pidgin Latin blended with Greek, Arabic and Germanic tongues to create trade, dialects. And in the church and universities, a frozen scholarly Latin persisted as a lingua franca for the educated, though the 8th century monk who wrote O Roma Nobilis probably couldn't have conversed with Augustus. The physical ruins inspired equal parts awe and confusion. Medieval peasants living amidst Roman aqueducts and roads had no concept of their original purpose. The Anglo-Saxons called the crumbling walls of Roman towns enter gework, the work of giants. Italian farmers, ploughing their fields, routinely uncovered mosaic floors and statues they assumed were pagan idols, which they often were, though not in the way they imagined. Even the educated developed fantastical explanations. The Roman baths at Bath were said to have been built by the wizard Bloodhood, while the massive scale of imperial ruins fed legends of a race of superhuman ancestors. Law proved Rome's most enduring export. The Visigothic Code, the Burgundian laws, even the Anglo-Saxon dooms, all bore unmistakable Roman influence in their structure and reasoning. The very concept of written law as something transcending tribal custom was a Roman idea that outlasted the empire. When medieval jurists rediscovered Justinian's Digest in the 11th century, they weren't uncovering lost knowledge so much as recognizing the source of principles that had survived in bastardized form for centuries. The English common law system, often portrayed as a Germanic alternative to Roman tradition, actually borrowed heavily from canon law, which was itself thoroughly Romanized. The military legacy was more ambiguous. The stirrup and mounted warfare had rendered the legion obsolete, yet Roman strategic thinking persisted in surprising ways. Byzantine generals still studied Vegetius's De Re Militari, while Charlemagne's campaigns followed Roman marching patterns. The medieval castle owed as much to Roman frontier forts as to any barbarian innovation. Even the concept of knighthood contained echoes of the late Roman equites, heavily armored cavalry who formed the nucleus of imperial armies in the waning days. Economic systems displayed similar, half-remembered continuity. The manorial system that replaced imperial villas wasn't so much a new invention as a degeneration of Diocletian's tide colonnade. Medieval guilds traced their lineage to Roman collegia. The great fairs of Champagne followed routes established by Roman merchants centuries earlier. Even the much-vaunted commercial revolution of the late Middle Ages simply rediscovered financial instruments Romans had used before the collapse: bills of exchange, maritime insurance, and sophisticated contract law. The intellectual inheritance proved both blessing and curse. Monastic scribes preserved classical texts, but often misunderstood them. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy became a medieval bestseller, while Aristotle's more challenging works gathered dust until Arabic translations retransmitted them to Europe. The 7 liberal arts curriculum was a Roman invention that survived the Dark Ages, largely intact, though few remembered its original purpose. This selective preservation created odd gaps in knowledge. 12th century scholars could debate Cicero's rhetorical techniques while remaining ignorant of basic Roman sanitation practices that would have saved countless lives. The eastern half of the empire watched this clumsy Western nostalgia with equal parts contempt and longing. Byzantine emperors maintained the fiction of Roman continuity even as Greek completely replaced Latin. Their scholars preserved classical knowledge the West had lost, but increasingly viewed it through a Christian lens that would have baffled Augustine, let alone Marcus Aurelius. When the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, they weren't just looting a rival Christian city, they were desecrating the last living remnant of the Roman state, albeit one that would have been unrecognizable to Scipio Africanus. The Renaissance's rediscovery of Rome was in many ways a rediscovery of what had never been entirely lost. Petrarch's letters to Cicero were poignant, not because he'd uncovered something truly forgotten, but because he recognized in those ancient texts a sophistication his own age still couldn't match. The humanists didn't so much revive classical learning as finally begin to understand what had been sitting in monastery libraries all along. Brunelleschi's dome on Florence Cathedral was less an innovation than the first competent application of Roman engineering principles in nearly a millennium. Even the New World felt Rome's posthumous influence. Spanish conquistadors carried Roman legal concepts to the Americas, where they justified both colonization and, ironically, the arguments of those who defended native rights. The United States Constitution borrowed heavily from Republican Rome via Montesquieu's Enlightenment interpretations. Napoleon styled himself emperor in direct imitation of Caesar, while his legal code owed more to Justinian than to any French. Tradition. The industrial age seemed to finally break Rome's spell until one looked closer. Modern bureaucracies still follow hierarchical models pioneered by Diocletian. The very concept of professional standing armies is Roman rather than medieval. Civil law systems across Europe and Latin America remain deeply indebted to Roman precedents. Even the English common law tradition, for all its Germanic elements, incorporates Roman principles through the back door of canon law and equity. In the digital age, the parallels grow stranger still. Globalization recreates something akin to the Roman economic zone, complete with dominant languages, English today, Latin then, and standardized systems of exchange. The Internet's combination of libertarian ideals and corporate control mirrors Rome's uneasy balance between republican rhetoric and imperial reality. Modern populist strongmen borrow their playbook directly from the Gracchi to Julius Caesar, pitting the true people against corrupt elites while hollowing out institutions. The ultimate irony? Rome's true legacy isn't in the ruins tourists photograph or the laws scholars study. It's in the assumptions we can't even recognize as Roman. The idea that laws should apply equally, at least in theory, that infrastructure serves a public purpose, that citizenship confers certain rights. These concepts were radical when Rome invented them and remain revolutionary in much of the world today. The monk in his scriptorium couldn't have imagined how long Cicero's shadow would stretch. As he blew out his candle each night, he feared the light of learning might flicker out forever. He was wrong. The light didn't vanish. It scattered like seeds from a crushed pomegranate, taking root in places and times far removed from its origin. Rome never really fell. It just learned to live in pieces. Chapter 10. Echoes in the bones, why Rome never left us. The senator's ghost still walks the halls of power. Not in spectral form, but in the unspoken assumptions that shape our world. When a modern politician stands before a crowd and invokes the people, he channels Cicero's contortions of populism and privilege. When bureaucrats design tax codes with loopholes for the wealthy, they follow patterns established by Diocletian's accountants. Even the way we argue about immigration, who belongs, who deserves what, echoes Caracalla's edict extending citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, not from altruism, but because the tax base was collapsing. Rome isn't ancient history. It's an operating system still running in the background of Western civilization, its code visible only when the screen flickers. The myth of clean breaks obscures the truth. We imagine history as a series of distinct epochs, ancient, medieval, modern, as if someone rang a bell in 476 AD and the world suddenly became Dark Ages. But the Vandals who sacked Rome wore Roman military belts and carried Roman-style swords. The barbarian kings who replaced imperial governors still collected taxes in Roman coinage for decades after the fall. What changed wasn't the structures of power, but who controlled them and how they justified their rule. The same pattern repeats today. Revolutions that replace one elite with another while keeping the underlying machinery intact. Language remains Rome's most insidious legacy. Every time someone says agenda, literally things to be done in Latin, or per capita, by heads, or quid pro quo, something for something, they're not just using Latin phrases, they're invoking Roman ways of thinking. Legal English is particularly haunted. Habeas corpus, subpoena, pro bono. These aren't fancy decorations but fossilized Roman concepts about personhood and obligation. Even the word money derives from Rome's temple of Juno Moneta, where coins were minted. The empire colonized our tongue so thoroughly we don't even notice the occupation. Architecture tells a similar story of unconscious inheritance. Walk through any major city and the Roman bones protrude, neoclassical banks, aping temple fronts, courthouses modelled on basilicas, even sewer systems that follow Roman gradients. More subtly, the very idea that public spaces should be adorned with monumental architecture is Roman to its core. The Greeks built perfect temples in isolation. Romans insisted on forums, baths and amphitheatres as expressions of civic power. Our sports stadiums and shopping malls are direct descendants, spaces designed for mass consumption under the pretense of communal virtue. The military-industrial complex has a Latin pedigree. Rome's genius and curse was turning war into a self-perpetuating industry. The late Republic's problem of retired legionaries demanding land finds its echo in modern defense contractors lobbying for perpetual conflict. The Pentagon's bread and circuses approach to defense spending, spreading bases and contracts across congressional districts, mirrors how emperors distributed legions to keep provinces dependent. Even the concept of a professional standing army, rather than citizen militias, was a Roman innovation that changed the fundamental relationship between state and violence. Our entertainment still feeds on Roman appetites. Reality TV shows are just gladiatorial combat with fewer swords and more emotional manipulation. The tabloid obsession with celebrity downfalls mirrors the Roman taste for humiliating the powerful, from stripping corrupt officials of status to parading defeated kings in triumphs. Modern pornography follows conventions established in Pompeii's brothel frescoes. Even our sanitized CGI spectacles, like superhero movies, fulfill the same function as mythological pageants did for Roman audiences. Moral fables dressed in special effects where might ultimately confirms right. The welfare state owes more to Rome than Marx. From the grain dole to Trajan's alimenta, a system of child welfare payments, Roman rulers understood that redistribution was cheaper than revolution. The means tests and bureaucratic hurdles of modern social programs descend directly from Augustus' means-tested grain eligibility lists. The concept of entitlements itself comes from the Roman client-patron system, where loyalty was exchanged for material support. When politicians debate universal basic income today, they're revisiting arguments first had in the Curia Julia. Capitalism wears a Roman toga. The joint stock company may be a Dutch invention, but the corporate mentality began with Roman societates that pooled investor money for Mediterranean trade. Bankruptcy law preserves Roman distinctions between honest and fraudulent failure. Even modern corporate structures echo Roman business practices. Offshore accounting tricks resemble how elite Romans used provincial intermediaries to evade taxes, while modern lobbying is just a more sophisticated version of wealthy patrons buying senatorial favors. The lex mercatoria, merchant law, that governed medieval trade was essentially Roman commercial law with Christian modifications. Our environmental crises rhyme with Rome's. Deforestation in the ancient world wasn't caused by ignorance, Roman. Writers like Pliny the Elder warned about soil depletion and unsustainable logging. The lead pipes that poisoned Roman aristocrats find their parallel in Flint's water crisis. Even climate change has precursors in Rome's experience. The dust veil of 536 AD, likely caused by volcanic eruptions, triggered crop failures, migrations, and political instability eerily similar to modern climate refugee scenarios. The difference is one of scale, not kind. Technology changed everything except human nature. A Roman transported to today would be baffled by smartphones, but instantly understand tax evasion, political corruption, and generational wealth. The graffiti at Pompeii, from election slogans to crude jokes, could have been written yesterday. The love letters found at Vindolanda Roman fort reveal emotions completely familiar despite 2 millennia of separation. The technology changes, the people using it barely do. The most Roman thing about modernity may be our blindness to it. Just as medieval monks copied texts without fully grasping their context, we deploy Roman systems while forgetting their origins. The US Senate isn't modeled on Rome's by accident. The Founding Fathers consciously imitated what they admired and misunderstood about Republican governance. European Union bureaucrats in Brussels replicate imperial administration without acknowledging the parallels. Even China's Belt and Road Initiative follows the logic of Roman roads and client kingdoms more closely than it does Marxist theory. The lesson isn't that history repeats, it's that we've never stopped living in Rome's shadow. The same dilemmas of citizenship and belonging, of inequality and justice, of imperial overreach and provincial resentment continue playing out with different costumes. The barbarians aren't at the gates anymore, they're in the boardrooms and legislative chambers, using Roman tools to dismantle Roman systems while pretending to preserve them. Perhaps this is why Rome fascinates us so, not because it's distant, but because it's the mirror we can't look away from. All our triumphs of law and technology, all our pretensions of progress, haven't changed the fundamental equation. Civilization remains a fragile construct, always closer to unraveling than we admit. The Roman poet Juvenal asked, "Quis custodiet ipsos custodes?" Who watches the watchers? 2,000 years later, we're still struggling with the same question. Not because we lack answers, but because Rome taught us how dangerous all the possible answers are. In the end, Rome never fell. It just learned to wear new disguises, and we, whether we know it or not, are still playing our assigned parts in its endless drama. The script has changed, the stage has expanded, but the essential story remains. How power corrupts, how institutions decay, and how people keep trying to build something lasting amid the ruins of previous attempts. The senator's ghost still walks the halls of power, not in spectral form, but in the unspoken assumptions that shape our world. When a modern politician stands before a crowd and invokes the people, he channels Cicero's contortions of populism and privilege. When bureaucrats design tax codes with loopholes for the wealthy, they follow patterns established by Diocletian's accountants. Even the way we argue about immigration, who belongs, who deserves what, echoes Caracalla's edict extending citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, not from altruism, but because the tax base was collapsing. Rome isn't ancient history. It's an operating system still running in the background of Western civilization, its code visible only when the screen flickers. The myth of clean breaks obscures the truth. We imagine history as a series of distinct epochs, ancient, medieval, modern, as if someone rang a bell in 476 AD and the world suddenly became Dark Ages. But the Vandals who sacked Rome wore Roman military belts and carried Roman-style swords. The barbarian kings who replaced imperial governors still collected taxes in Roman coinage for decades after the fall. What changed wasn't the structures of power, but who controlled them and how they justified their rule. The same pattern repeats today, revolutions that replace one elite with another while keeping the underlying machinery intact. Language remains Rome's most insidious legacy. Every time someone says agenda, literally things to be done in Latin, or per capita, by heads, or quid pro quo, something for something, they're not just using Latin phrases, they're invoking Roman ways of thinking. Legal English is particularly haunted. Habeas corpus, subpoena, pro bono, these aren't fancy decorations, but fossilized Roman concepts about personhood and obligation. Even the word money derives from Rome's temple of Juno Moneta, where coins were minted. The empire colonized our tongues so thoroughly, we don't even notice the occupation. Architecture tells a similar story of unconscious inheritance. Walk through any major city, and the Roman bones protrude. Neoclassical banks, aping temple fronts, courthouses modelled on basilicas, even sewer systems that follow Roman gradients. More subtly, the very idea that public spaces should be adorned with monumental architecture is Roman to its core. The Greeks built perfect temples in isolation. Romans insisted on forums, baths, and amphitheatres as expressions of civic power. Our sports stadiums and shopping malls are direct descendants. Space is designed for mass consumption under the pretense of communal virtue. The military-industrial complex has a Latin pedigree. Rome's genius and curse was turning war into a self-perpetuating industry. The late Republic's problem of retired legionaries demanding land finds its echo in modern defense contractors lobbying for perpetual conflict. The Pentagon's bread and circuses approach to defense spending, spreading bases and contracts across congressional districts, mirrors how emperors distributed legions to keep provinces dependent. Even the concept of a professional standing army rather than citizen militias was a Roman innovation that changed the fundamental relationship between state and violence. Our entertainment still feeds on Roman appetites. Reality TV shows are just gladiatorial combat with fewer swords and more emotional manipulation. The tabloid obsession with celebrity downfalls mirrors the Roman taste for humiliating the powerful, from stripping corrupt officials of status to parading defeated kings in triumphs. Modern pornography follows conventions established in Pompeii's brothel frescoes. Even our sanitized CGI spectacles like superhero movies fulfill the same function as mythological pageants did for Roman audiences. Moral fables dressed in special effects where might ultimately confirms right. The welfare state owes more to Rome than Marx. From the grain dole to Trajan's alimenta, a system of child welfare payments, Roman rulers understood that redistribution was cheaper than revolution. The means tests and bureaucratic hurdles of modern social programs descend directly from Augustus's means-tested grain eligibility lists. The concept of entitlements itself comes from the Roman client-patron system, where loyalty was exchanged for material support. When politicians debate universal basic income today, they're revisiting arguments first had in the Curia Julia. Capitalism wears a Roman toga. The joint stock company may be a Dutch invention, but the corporate mentality began with Roman societates that pooled investor money for Mediterranean trade. Bankruptcy law preserves Roman distinctions between honest and fraudulent failure. Even modern corporate structures echo Roman business practices. Offshore accounting tricks resemble how elite Romans used provincial intermediaries to evade taxes, while modern lobbying is just a more sophisticated version of wealthy patrons buying senatorial favors. The lex mercatoria, merchant law, that governed medieval trade was essentially Roman commercial law with Christian modifications. Our environmental crises rhyme with Rome's. Deforestation in the ancient world wasn't caused by ignorance. Roman. Writers like Pliny the Elder warned about soil depletion and unsustainable logging. The lead pipes that poisoned Roman aristocrats find their parallel in Flint's water crisis. Even climate change has precursors in Rome's experience. The dust veil of 536 AD, likely caused by volcanic eruptions, triggered crop failures, migrations, and political instability eerily similar to modern climate refugee scenarios. The difference is one of scale, not kind. Technology changed everything except human nature. A Roman transported to today would be baffled by smartphones, but instantly understand tax evasion, political corruption, and generational wealth. The graffiti at Pompeii, from election slogans to crude jokes, could have been written yesterday. The love letters found at Vindolanda Roman fort reveal emotions completely familiar, despite 2 millennia of separation. The technology changes. The people using it barely do. The most Roman thing about modernity may be our blindness to it. Just as medieval monks copied texts without fully grasping their context, we deploy Roman systems while forgetting their origins. The US Senate isn't modeled on Rome's by accident. The Founding Fathers consciously imitated what they admired and misunderstood about Republican governance. European Union bureaucrats in Brussels replicate imperial administration without acknowledging the parallels. Even China's Belt and Road Initiative follows the logic of Roman roads and client kingdoms more closely than it does Marxist theory. The lesson isn't that history repeats. It's that we've never stopped living in Rome's shadow. The same dilemmas of citizenship and belonging, of inequality and justice, of imperial overreach and provincial resentment continue playing out with different costumes. The barbarians aren't at the gates anymore. They're in the boardrooms and legislative chambers, using Roman tools to dismantle Roman systems while pretending to preserve them. Perhaps this is why Rome fascinates us so. Not because it's distant, but because it's the mirror we can't look away from. All our triumphs of law and technology, all our pretensions of progress, haven't changed the fundamental equation. Civilization remains a fragile construct, always closer to unraveling than we admit. The Roman poet Juvenal asked, "Quis custodiet ipsos custodes?" Who watches the watchers? 2,000 years later, we're still struggling with the same question, not because we lack answers, but because Rome taught us how dangerous all the possible answers are. In the end, Rome never fell. It just learned to wear new disguises. And we, whether we know it or not, are still playing our assigned parts in its endless drama. The script has changed, the stage has expanded, but the essential story remains. How power corrupts, how institutions decay, and how people keep trying to build something lasting amid the ruins of previous attempts. The curtain never fell. It just keeps rising on new acts of the same play. Chapter 11. The DNA of Empire. Rome's blueprint in modern bones. The parchment crackled as the medieval monk traced his quill across the page, copying Cicero's words by flickering candlelight. He didn't realize he was participating in the oldest game in Western civilization, the illusion that Rome ever really ended. That monk's monastery stood on the foundations of a Roman villa. The Latin he painstakingly preserved would evolve into the vernacular he'd never understand. And the very act of recording knowledge systematically was a Roman habit older than Christ. This is how empires truly endure, not through marble monuments or legionary standards, but through the silent colonization of imagination. Modern nation-states aren't Rome's successors. They're its unwitting clones. The American Founding Fathers drafted their constitution with Plutarch's Lives open on their desks, consciously modeling their Senate on an institution that had already failed catastrophically twice. First as a republic, then as an imperial rubber stamp. The European Union's bureaucracy mirrors Diocletian's tetrarchy more closely than any modern democratic ideal. China's Belt and Road Initiative follows the precise economic logic of Roman client states. Trade routes as tentacles of control. These aren't coincidences. They're evidence that Rome's operating system never crashed. It just keeps rebooting on new hardware. Language remains the most insidious vector of Roman persistence. Every time a lawyer files a subpoena, literally under penalty, or a politician declares a quorum of whom, they're not just using Latin, they're activating Roman neural pathways. Legal English is particularly haunted. Habeas corpus, pro bono, amicus curiae, these aren't decorative flourishes but fossilized Roman concepts about personhood and obligation. Even the word money derives from Rome's temple of Juno Moneta, where coins were minted. The empire colonized our tongues so thoroughly we don't even notice the occupation. Military-industrial complexes follow Roman blueprints. The Pentagon's base system, sprawling installations that dominate local economies, perfectly replicates Rome's legionary fortresses turned cities. The defense contractor revolving door mirrors the late imperial practice of hiring barbarian mercenaries who then demanded political power. Even modern counterinsurgency doctrine echoes Rome's mix of brutal reprisals and strategic infrastructure. Projects to pacify regions. The only real innovation, drones instead of crucifixions. Our entertainment still feeds Roman appetites with updated packaging. Reality TV is the Colosseum with fewer swords and more emotional disembowelment. Celebrity gossip sites serve the same function as Suetonius's lurid imperial biographies, allowing plebeians to feel superior to decadent elites. Superhero movies are just mythological pageants with better CGI fulfilling Rome's original formula. Simplistic morality tales where might ultimately confirms right. Even pornography follows compositional rules established in Pompeii's brothel frescoes 2 millennia ago. The welfare state owes more to Caesar than Marx. From Trajan's alimenta, child welfare payments, to Augustus' means-tested grain dole, Roman rulers mastered the art of giving just enough to prevent revolution. Modern social programs repeat this calculus with better demographics. Entitlement systems designed not for justice, but to maintain stability. The bureaucratic hurdles facing applicants today would feel familiar to a Roman peasant proving his eligibility for the annona. Even the concept of deserving poor versus lazy mob originates in Seneca's letters. Capitalism wears a Roman toga. Modern corporate structures are societates, Roman joint ventures with better accounting. Offshore tax havens follow the same. Logic as Roman elites registering assets in provincial allies' names. Private equity firms are the delatores, informers, of late antiquity reborn, profiting by dismantling systems others built. Even cryptocurrency's speculative frenzy mirrors Rome's currency debasement crises, just with blockchain instead of clipped coins. Environmental crises rhyme across millennia. Roman writers like Columella warned about soil exhaustion and deforestation. Centuries before the empire collapsed, lead pipes poisoned Roman aristocrats, just as PFAS chemicals infiltrate modern suburbs. The climate migration crises we face today mirror Rome's experience with the dust veil of 536 AD, except our volcanic eruptions are metaphorical, pumped from tailpipes and smokestacks. The pattern remains. Civilizations mine their own foundations. Until the roof caves in, technology changed everything except human nature. A Roman senator teleported to Capitol Hill would need 5 minutes to understand lobbying. A merchant from Ostia would recognize modern shipping contracts instantly. The graffiti at Pompeii, from political slogans to crude jokes, could have been written yesterday. The Vindolanda tablets reveal love letters and birthday invitations emotionally identical to modern texts. Tools evolve. The hands holding them don't. The most Roman thing about modernity is our blindness to it. We mistake familiar systems for natural ones, never questioning why governments have senates instead of parliaments, why laws privilege property over people, why infrastructure serves capital before citizens. These aren't universal truths. They're Roman choices, fossilized into unquestioned norms. Like fish unaware of water, we swim in antiquity's legacy. This isn't to say history repeats. It's worse. We're still living the same story, just with different special effects. The barbarians aren't at the gates anymore. They're in the boardrooms and legislative chambers, using Roman tools to dismantle Roman systems while pretending to preserve them. The legions don't march on roads anymore. They drone strike from server farms. Bread and circuses don't come from imperial treasuries. They're delivered via algorithm and streaming subscription. Perhaps this explains Rome's endless fascination. Not because it's ancient history, but because it's our operating manual, one we've never bothered to replace. All our crises of democracy, inequality, and institutional decay were road-tested in the Forum centuries before they reached Capitol Hill or Westminster. The solutions may lie not in innovating forward, but in finally understanding what we've been carrying all along. The monk's candle eventually guttered out. The empire whose words he preserved was already centuries dead. Yet here we are, still parsing its grammar, still trapped in its syntax, still dreaming in a language we only half comprehend. Rome's true triumph wasn't conquering the ancient world. It was convincing all who came after that we had no choice but to rebuild its walls. Chapter 12, The Last Lesson, What the Ruins Whisper. The cold wind howls through the broken arches of the Forum Romanum, scattering dust that once formed the walls of an empire. Tourists shuffle past, listening to guides prattle about emperors, and gladiators completely missing the real story underfoot. The ruins aren't just relics, they're a mirror. That cracked marble column reflects more than ancient glory. It shows the fractures in our own civilization. Rome doesn't just teach us how empires fall. It shows us we're already speaking in its dying gasps. The parallels aren't just theoretical, they're physiological. Modern civilization has developed the same symptoms that plagued Rome in its terminal phase. The lead pipes poisoning Roman aristocrats find their echo in the microplastics coursing through our veins. The bread and circuses have been upgraded to streaming services and social media algorithms, but the purpose remains identical: distraction in exchange for complacency. Even our political theatre follows the same script. The late Republic's gridlock between optimates and populares looks uncomfortably like modern partisan warfare, complete with wealthy elites manipulating populist anger to maintain control. Economic inequality has returned to Roman extremes. When the top 1% of Romans controlled 16% of the empire's wealth, it marked the beginning of the end. Today, that number has been surpassed in dozens of nations. The billionaire space race mirrors the worst excesses of imperial decadence. Nero's Domus Aurea palace complex would fit right in among modern vanity projects for the ultra-rich. Our new client-patron relationships hide behind corporate branding. Amazon warehouses replace latifundia plantations, with workers still living paycheck to paycheck, while executives emulate patrician lifestyles. The Roman practice of wealthy citizens funding public works to burnish their reputations has been reborn as billionaire philanthropy, the same wealth extraction repackaged as charity. Military overextension follows the same tragic arc. Rome's borders became unsustainable long before the barbarians broke through. The empire simply couldn't admit its reach exceeded its grasp. Modern parallels range from America's forever wars to Russia's imperial nostalgia to China's debt trap. Diplomacy. The late imperial practice of hiring barbarian mercenaries because citizens wouldn't serve finds its counterpart in Western nations outsourcing military recruitment to economically desperate communities. Even the weaponization of migration as a political tool echoes Rome's manipulation of Gothic tribes, short-term tactical gains, creating long-term existential threats. The environmental parallels are even more chilling. Roman deforestation created the wheat shortages that destabilized the empire. Modern climate change disrupts global supply chains. Lead poisoning contributed to Rome's neurological decline. PFAS chemicals and microplastics may be doing the same to industrial civilizations. Most damningly, both societies received clear warnings they chose to ignore. Pliny the Elder wrote about soil depletion and conservation, just as modern scientists warn about carbon thresholds and biodiversity collapse. The key difference? Rome's environmental damage was local. Ours is global. Cultural decay manifests in eerily similar ways. The late empire's obsession with nostalgic kitsch, cheap copies of classical art, recycled philosophical cliches, mirrors our reboot culture and thought leader platitudes. Roman. Education shifted from critical thinking to rote memorization. Modern schools increasingly emphasize standardized testing over intellectual development. Even our religious landscape follows Rome's syncretic pattern. New Age spirituality blends. Traditions like Mithraism absorbed elements from conquered territories, while megachurches offer community belonging like the imperial cult once did. Technology hasn't saved us. It's just accelerated the cycle. Roman concrete allowed them to build faster than their institutions could maintain. Digital technology has done the same to modern societies. Social media didn't create polarization. It simply turbocharged the same dynamics that filled the Colosseum with screaming mobs. The internet's combination of libertarian ideals and corporate control perfectly replicates Rome's tension between republican rhetoric and imperial reality. Even cryptocurrency mania mirrors Rome's currency debasement, speculative bubbles replacing real value creation. The crucial difference between Rome and us? We have their autopsy report. Every pathology that killed Rome has been documented for centuries. We know how corruption metastasizes, how inequality destabilizes, how environmental degradation undermines civilizations. The Vandals didn't have the benefit of reading Gibbon before they sacked Rome, but we can study the exact mechanisms of imperial collapse even as we replicate them. This isn't pessimism, it's the opposite. Rome's greatest lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable, but that it's preventable. The empire didn't fall because of some unstoppable external force. It rotted from within through thousands of small choices. The same applies in reverse. Civilizations are maintained through daily acts of stewardship. The aqueducts didn't clog overnight. The laws didn't corrupt in a day. The legions didn't mutiny spontaneously. Each failure was preceded by countless warnings ignored, repairs deferred, principles compromised. The ruins whisper this warning. Civilization isn't a monument, but a process. Rome survived the Republic's fall, the 3rd century crisis, even the sack of the capital, not because of its institutions, but because enough people still believed in the idea of Rome to keep rebuilding it. Our civilization faces the same test, not whether our infrastructure will crumble, it will, or our politics will degenerate, they are, but whether enough of us still believe in maintaining something worth passing forward. As the sun sets over the Forum, the shadows lengthen across stones that have outlasted empires. The tourists depart, the guides fall silent, and for a moment, there's just the wind moving through empty spaces where laws were debated, fortunes won and lost. History made. The stones don't care about empires, they only endure. The choice was never theirs. It was always ours. We stand where Romans stood in their final centuries, surrounded by the achievements of greater ancestors, wielding tools we barely understand, building a future we may not deserve. They couldn't save their Rome, But we might still save ours if we stop pretending we're different and start acting like we've learned something. The last lesson of Rome isn't about the past. It's about what comes after us. What fragments will future civilizations sift from our ruins? What warnings will they wish we'd heeded? The answers aren't written in stone yet, but time is running out to change them. Chapter 13. Breaking the Wheel. The exit Rome never found. The mouldering parchment in the Vatican archives tells a revealing lie. Dated 452 AD, it shows a Roman bureaucrat's meticulous record of tax assessments for a North African province, just as Attila's hordes massed along the Danube. The handwriting never wavers. The columns of figures remain precise. Here was an empire that could calculate the yield of an olive grove to the amphora, while blind to its own impending collapse. This is the final and most dangerous Roman legacy. Not how they fell, but how they kept pretending the fall wasn't happening. We face the same willful blindness today, but with one crucial advantage. We have their autopsy report. Every pathology that killed Rome, institutional rigidity, elite capture, environmental degradation, has been dissected for centuries. The question is no longer, will we repeat their mistakes? But why do we keep choosing to? The Roman playbook persists because it's addictive. Power structures replicate themselves like viruses. Modern democracies inherited Rome's senatorial theatrics without its occasional meritocratic filters. Corporate hierarchies mimic imperial bureaucracies that prioritized stability over innovation. Even our crisis responses follow Roman patterns, temporary fixes that kick systemic problems down crumbling roads. The late empire's temporary military dictatorships lasted centuries. Our emergency security measures and economic bailouts become permanent fixtures. The mechanism is always the same. Institutions designed for preservation gradually choke adaptation. The bread and circuses evolved, but the recipe didn't. Where Rome had grain doles and gladiatorial games, we have algorithmic outrage and streaming distractions. The Colosseum's genius wasn't the blood sport. It was the engineered catharsis, the careful dosing of violence and mercy to keep the mob invested in the system. Modern media empires perfected this formula. Social platforms that monetize anger, news cycles that reduce governance to spectator sport, a culture industry that spins rebellion into consumable aesthetics. The late empire's citizens knew they were being manipulated, but couldn't imagine alternatives. Our predicament mirrors theirs exactly. Yet, alternatives have always existed, just off Rome's radar. The Iroquois Confederacy's decentralized democracy lasted longer than Rome's republic without collapsing into autocracy. The Hanseatic League's trade networks created prosperity without conquest. Indigenous water management systems sustained civilizations in deserts where Roman aqueducts would have failed. These models shared key traits Rome lacked: fluid power structures, regenerative resource use, and, most crucially, the ability to shrink gracefully when necessary. Where Rome saw only expansion or collapse, other cultures built elasticity into their systems. The military-first model was never inevitable. Rome assumed security required endless expansion, a belief that bankrupted them morally and financially. Contrast Phoenicia's thalassocracy, trade-based empire, or the Silk Road's collaborative networks. These systems understood that wealth could flow without being seized, that influence didn't require occupation. Modern nations repeating Rome's mistakes, fighting forever wars to maintain dollar hegemony, sacrificing social infrastructure for military budgets, ignore these lessons at their peril. The Pentagon's 800 foreign bases would give Diocletian pause. Breaking the cycle requires rewiring three core systems. Replacing clientelism with real representation. Rome's patronage system never truly died. It just put on suits. Modern lobbying operates on identical principles. Access traded for favors, policy shaped by donor whims. The solution isn't better politicians, but better architectures. Sortition, random citizen assemblies, decentralized blockchain voting, AI-monitored conflict of interest tracking. Iceland's crowd-sourced constitution experiment proved alternatives exist. Its suppression proved how fiercely the old system fights back. Short-circuiting the inequality doom loop, Rome's latifundia, mega estates, destroyed small farms, creating an idle urban underclass. Today's equivalent, tech monopolies hollowing. Out middle classes, hedge funds buying entire neighborhoods, follows the same wealth concentration playbook. Breaking it requires radical interventions. Land value taxes, universal asset endowments, maybe even the Roman agrarian laws conservatives once feared. Periodic wealth redistribution to prevent oligarchy. Treating environmental stewardship as survival, not virtue. Rome collapsed during a climate shift it helped accelerate. Deforestation leading to soil erosion, lead pipes poisoning water supplies. Our version, microplastics in bloodstreams, CO2 triggering crop failures, demands more than recycling campaigns. It requires rebuilding civilization as a closed-loop system, mycelium-based construction replacing concrete, permaculture replacing industrial agriculture, ocean alkalization projects scaling to Roman aqueduct ambition. The obstacle isn't technology, but imagination. Rome's fatal flaw was assuming all problems required Roman solutions. More legions for barbarian threats, more games for civil unrest, more bureaucracy for administrative decay. We repeat this error daily, addressing algorithmic dystopias with new apps, climate collapse with incremental reforms, political corruption with, somehow, more politics. The exit lies in questioning the underlying code. What if citizenship wasn't about voting once every 4 years, but continuous governance participation? What if economic health wasn't measured in GDP, but in regenerative capacity? What if security meant resilience rather than military dominance? The ruins whisper that civilizations don't fail, they choose to. Pompeii's last graffiti wasn't some profound epitaph, but a tavern keeper's inventory list. Herculaneum's libraries were packed with scrolls no one read as the pyroclastic flow approached. The lesson isn't that they didn't see the end coming, but that seeing wasn't enough. Knowledge without action is just archaeology waiting to happen. Our advantage and last hope is that we're watching Rome's collapse in reverse. Their ruins are our preview, their archives our warning labels, their ghosts our most valuable consultants. The wheel can be broken, but first we must stop worshipping. The parchment ends abruptly, the bureaucrat likely called away to some immediate crisis. His numbers remain frozen in ink, perfectly preserved and perfectly useless. We have a choice, he didn't. We can close the ledger, start fresh, write different numbers, or better yet, a different kind of story altogether. Rome's greatest gift wasn't what it built. It's the chance to learn what they couldn't. The future doesn't have to be a rerun, but first we have to change the channel.